The hidden reason ex-smokers crave cigarettes years later. How nicotine rewires the brain and triggers cravings long after quitting. Let's talk about it. So I want to help you out. I've been a non-smoker for almost 10 years. I've had one-off cravings for nicotine around the 1 year to the present, and I was unable to fully explain. And I thought it would be great to make this video because I've recently had cravings and need an explanation of why I would still have nicotine cravings after all this time. And I do just want to say, if you have any comments or you need any help, just send me a message and I'll see what I can do. I've been down the same road you have. Okay, so here's some sobering statistics. This is from a Chinese study. I think it was 2000 to 2008. Almost 2/3 of smokers relapse within 8 years. About a third stay quit. And here's an older study from 1982 to 1984 in the United States. So here's the 1 year mark, 100% quit. And over time, you can see a third of smokers had returned by year 12. So first thing I want to make clear up front is that you are no longer addicted to nicotine. If you have had it out of your blood for 8 hours, it has a very short half-life, 2 hours. So, nicotine is not really the problem. The problem is what nicotine is doing to your brain, the permanent changes. It's this guy right here. Acetylcholines, they're neurotransmitters. They're just part of the natural function of your brain. They work in cognition and memory, muscle control, basic functions like heart rate, digestion, and arousal. Nicotinic ACHRSs play a role in attention, reward, and addiction, mostly found in the brain, not exclusively, and there are different subtypes. Nicotine binds to these receptors and releases dopamine, which feels fantastic, which is how people get hooked. The problem with these receptors is the brain produces additional receptors because nicotine desensitizes your normal amount of receptors. So if you have more receptors, it takes more nicotine to feel normal. Everyone has them, but smokers have about 100 to 300% more than non-smokers do. I find it's hard to find data on exactly how long these receptors last in the brain, but it seems like most of them will last a week to 2 weeks, which tracks with what I've experienced when I quit smoking. The worst symptoms were within the first 2 weeks. The brain eliminates excess receptors because it doesn't need them anymore. It's wasteful. Existing receptors become more sensitive, and it doesn't replace the receptors that break down. But there have been some studies that show it can take 6 to 12 months for these receptors to return close to non-smoker levels. So here's my hypothesis of why ex-smokers have these issues years later. I think the brain associates memories with nicotine. And when an event happens, your brain will dig up memories of similar events to kind of cope, use as a coping mechanism, use as a reference point. Let's say you moved 10 years ago and you just had a recent move. When you were dealing with the stress of that move, you're used to using nicotine. It's an irregular event that happened and your brain doesn't really know how to deal with it. So it pulls up the memory of that past experience and the stress that it caused, and then it remembers that nicotine provides a short-term fix. And I actually suspect, based on my own personal experience, that the brain will actually retain nicotinic receptors in certain areas of the brain where it considers these events particularly significant to its survival, a particularly traumatic event. It realizes that the nicotine was a coping mechanism. And I've also had it happen with random memories that I just haven't accessed in a long time. So I think it may be the case where it's kind of like having a hard drive with an old file folders on it, and you just never clean that hard drive up until you need the space. And, if these receptors there's not really researched on this, a lot of research, but if they can't exist that long, it is known that nicotine permanently rewires neural pathways of the brain. So it's possible that when you access those older memories, when they're triggered, that even if the nicotinic receptor is no longer there, there's still an empty hole there that has just left a blank that your brain knows should be filled with something. It's kind of like a missing puzzle piece. And your brain remembers that a nicotinic receptor can fit there, even if their one isn't currently there. So let's get to talking about the solutions. So knowing is half the battle. When you know how the process works, it's a lot easier to deal with it because you have already been through this process at least 100 times, right? You've been it when you've had that experience, when you've gotten over that cigarette after a meal, when you've gotten over the cigarette after you woken up, when you got that cigarette on your work break or after your job was done. You've gotten over all of those cigarettes. You have disassociated those nicotinic receptors with those memories in your brain. And this too will pass once you get over this event. It's not as intense as you think. It's certainly not as intense as the first couple weeks is when you quit. It just takes you by surprise. And that's where the real threat is. You're not prepared for it because you didn't think this was going to happen. So what I would do and what I do is I figure out the underlying trigger that is associated with the event or situation. It's usually, in my experience, stress or anxiety that you're unable to deal with. You know, if you have to go see a doctor, there's plenty of anti-anxiety medications out there that are non-habit forming that you can take on an infrequent basis just to get through that particular difficult period in your life. Stress, I mean, you can go see a counselor, you can go see a therapist to work through it. Nicotine is not the answer. You've already beat this. You know, you don't want to go back. And I would also suggest a very useful book that personally helped me quit. It wasn't the sole reason I quit, but it definitely helped. It is Alan Carr's The Easy Way to Stop Smoking. This book helps you sort out the psychological aspects of nicotine addiction, because there is also a strong psychological component to it. You know, besides the actual physical addiction of nicotine and the receptors in your brain, there's also a struggle where some people just have that dependency. And I actually reread this book a couple weeks ago and I found it very helpful. So, in closing, I hope this video helps you out, and I hope you stay strong. You know, if you've been a year quit, there is absolutely no reason to go back. You're just setting yourself up for a world of hurt where you're going to cause yourself all sorts of negative health side effects. You're going to be fighting this battle from the start all over again. You know, this is not something you have to do. Whatever you're going through in your life is not so bad that you have to go back to this addiction, which is making you sick. And I hope you have a wonderful year.